Raising Rebels. Complaints that kids today are lazy, entitled, and self-centered tend to be accompanied by a pile of prescriptions for how to improve them. Impose clear expectations and firm limits, then hold children accountable, in other words, punish them if they disobey. Push them toward self-sufficiency. Insist that self-worth and positive comments from others must be earned. Provide plenty of experiences with competition and failure. Promote self-discipline and grit. In essence, children should be well-behaved and hard-working. They should accommodate themselves to the unforgiving demands of the real world, follow the rules, and do what they're told. Throughout this book, I've rejected these recommendations, along with the unflattering descriptions of children with which they're associated. Now, I'd like to question the connection. Why is it so widely assumed that these beliefs about children, even if they were accurate, lead naturally to those recommendations? Imagine for a moment that there really was good reason to conclude that most young people think too much of themselves, or think only about themselves. Why should that prompt calls for a renewed focus on getting them to toe the line? Why, in short, would obedience be the cure for self-absorption or self-centeredness? I'd like to propose a different response. Encourage young people to focus on the needs and rights of others, to examine the practices and institutions that get in the way of making everyone's lives better, to summon the courage to question what one is told and be willing to break the rules sometimes. I'm not talking about a knee-jerk opposition to everything, the kind of reactive sensibility that was captured by the Marx Brothers lyric, "Whatever it is, I'm against it." Rather, I have in mind a thoughtful skepticism, a reflective rebelliousness, a selective defiance based on principle. One should be critical, in both senses of that word, willing to find fault, but also dependent on careful analysis. It's not, if you say yes, I'll say no, but rather, if you say or do something that doesn't make sense, I'll ask why. Then, if necessary, say no and suggest that other people do the same. I'm not talking about rudeness. Resistance should be not only reasoned, but also respectful. Nor am I talking about arrogance. One should turn a skeptical eye not only on what others are doing, but also on one's own beliefs and actions. Someone with a strong core of unconditional self-esteem has sufficient security to challenge him or herself and admit mistakes. To be critical only of other people's ideas is to risk hubris and stagnation. To be critical only of one's own ideas is to risk timidity and indecision. Finally, I'm not talking about cynicism. Instead, I want to promote skepticism, which means one doesn't automatically accept whatever people in authority say. A willingness to question the way things are paradoxically affirms a vision of the way things ought to be. One may well be offended by the violation of important values, such as honesty, compassion, or fairness, and as a result, moved to acts of resistance. The cynic, by contrast, remains passive and apolitical, dismissing activism as pointless and believing in nothing but self-interest. It's been said that the personal is political, and there's no doubt that parenting is intensely personal. To argue against traditional ways of raising children, or to suggest that we can help children stand up for what they think is right, doesn't introduce politics into parenting. It's always been there. If we failed to notice the political implications of child rearing, it may be because most advice on the subject has the effect of perpetuating the status quo, hence the need to keep asking cui bono. When, for example, a researcher such as Diana Baumrind defends the idea of moral internalization, which she defines as, quote, the process by which children come to espouse and conform to society's rules, even when they are free of external surveillance or the expectation of external inducement, unquote, that's intensely political. The cornerstone of her notion of authoritative discipline is the creation of built-in supervisors to ensure conformity. But too many people respond by asking, What's the most efficient way to achieve such internalization? And skirting the question of the value of those rules they're being asked to internalize. In fact, we should invite our children to join us in asking which rules are worth following and why. Whether we decide to do so will depend on our answer to a different sort of question. What kind of people do we want our children to become? Do we hope they'll be willing to question the existing order, to be outraged by outrageous things, to demand changes in unfair schools and workplaces? Or is the primary point to get them to conform to whatever exists? Almost half a century ago, conservatives blamed a surge in college campus unrest on permissive parenting. My first response in Chapter 1 was to question the accuracy of that causal link. Another response to their claim, however, might be blamed. If there really were a connection, it would constitute a powerful argument in favor of such parenting. The political and cultural activism of the 1960s, after all, was defined by efforts to challenge oppressive institutions and restrictive assumptions, to demand equal rights for women and people of color, to oppose war and promote awareness about the environmental costs of economic growth. If a certain approach to parenting really could produce people who devoted themselves to those democratizing struggles, we should be sharing the good news with parents today. My argument, in sum, is that the real alternative to narcissistic self-absorption is not mindless obedience, but reflective rebelliousness. And even though there is no credible evidence that narcissistic self-absorption is more common in today's youth than it was in those of previous generations, promoting reflective rebelliousness still seems like a pretty good idea.